I wanted to jump in and ask you something because I find the topic of protection interesting. So, the judicial system is obviously privatized in a narco capitalist system. And uh, resolving the issue of the courts, right? Uh, the courts are obviously there to take into account the appropriate legal procedures, right? Like prosecution, the collection of evidence, either by forensics or through many other multiple variables or methods in order to collect evidence. Obviously, there needs to be a trial held in place, and a jury needs to abide by those legal procedures and voting if they think that the person that is uh, being, you know, charged on such a crime is guilty or innocent. But considering the fact that the court system is privatized, wouldn't the judicial courts just represent the most affluent uh, middlemen in that situation? Would private courts just represent or abide by the whims of those who have the most money? Or will private courts actually do their job efficiently by abiding by legal procedures which carry out objective law?
Well, the first thing you have to start with in answering that question is to point out the fact that there would not be one justice system. There would be many competing arbitration
There will be
companies.
competing justice systems.
And each relationship that you have with somebody else would be governed by a agreement. So if I contracted with you to mow my lawn, in the agreement, we will specify the arbitration company that will handle a dispute if it comes to that. And there will be competition for your business in those contracts. And so if a company gets a reputation for siding with the big guy, they will lose business. So they will not want that kind of thing to be happening. That would be the probably largest market force or largest thing that would prevent that sort of thing from happening, is that each and every contract you sign, you can agree or not, you can consent or not consent to use this company or that company or that company. Unlike now, where there's one company and they can do all the things that you just said, right? They can side with their political benefactors and their politicians, and it has nothing to do with your consent.
People with affluence and a certain amount of economic power, right?
Yeah, you can pay off, you can buy judges and buy juries and all sorts of things, yeah.
Right, but I just think that in the concept in which you utilize your money for power, because these are, I view, the two concepts: political power and economic power. One embodies a gun and the other one does not. One is based off of voluntary exchange, the other one is based off of compulsion, right? But let's say you just said that there are competing judicial systems, right, that function within this market. And I'm a very affluent investor in one particular faction of that sector. And I want to collude with a certain, private court that abides by my favors to, never convict me of any crime that I ever inflict on someone else. Crime, I would suppose, would be something that is non-NAP compliance, something that violates the non-aggression principle that initiates force onto other sentient beings.
Yeah, so by definition, there is no political force in a free society. And
Right.
if you knew that this rich business guy you were about to get into a deal with, if you looked at his track record before you signed the contract and found that the dispute resolution in the contract he handed you, the dispute resolution company in the contract you handed you, had handled 7 cases previously, and 100% of those cases they sided with him. Maybe you don't sign that contract. Maybe you pick a different company.
Right. So you would imagine that this would work on an contractarian basis that would form this free market of a judicial system, correct?
Well, the competition is how you eliminate political power.
Right, but I'm just saying that competition needs to be based on procedures and guidelines and contracts beforehand.
Voluntary agreement is the word I would use, but okay.
Voluntary agreements. Well,
Consent.
you could argue that rights are a contract between two sentient beings.
Well, a contract is usually, written and signed, and
Right.
rights are just a mutual understanding generally.
Right. And so in the case they're reciprocated, right? The market needs to function based on those rights that were articulated. I just think that in order for a truly free market to exist, there needs to be some rights that prelude that market, right? There can't be a market on rights. I mean, the market needs to function when we assume that all these judicial courts mutually agree to protect individual rights.
Why can't there be first of all, a market on rights means that when you say you can't have a market on rights, what I hear is that you can't have two different groups of people that both mutually reciprocate different rights, and then you don't have an ability to choose which group of people you associate with.
Well, when I think of a market on rights, I don't view it only just as voluntary association. I'm worried about if rights are something that fluctuate between people, because if it does, then I just see it becoming dangerous, and dangerous in the sense of, well, I might walk into a bar that provides me some good services, right? And that bar is obviously private property or property. But for some reason, that that bar wants to allow stick beatings now, and that's obviously the initiation of force. That's obviously
It's not if you consent to being on the property under those rules.
well, but I can't consent to violence. I don't know how those two concepts correlate with each other.
If the rules for his property say that you may be beaten with sticks upon entering, and you enter the property, you consent to being beaten with sticks. And just to respond more generally to your point, like, we already exist in a state where rights fluctuate from region to region. If you go to California, they will rob you of your entire life and throw you in a cage for having a tiny little pistol. If you're in Texas and you have a 1-ounce vial of THC vape juice, you just lost 20 years of your life. It depends on where you are, what rights exist, and people are going to demand different types of rights, most of which I wouldn't even consider valid, but nevertheless humans are like that. So in a free society, I think you're still going to have different regions with different levels of rights respecting agreements, so to speak.
Right, but I still don't, because you said that it's as long as I consent to the stick beatings going on inside that bar, I mean, okay, but isn't isn't the consent to violence an anti-concept? Because I could say, well,
Tell that to
rape.
boxers.
Well, okay, but
Tell that to
well,
UFC
yeah,
combatants.
but that's a more officialized. Obviously, they're practicing a sport, and you can't compare that with the actual intent of hurting a human being. People who box have the intent to use violence in order to compete, right? But the intention is to compete on the level of sports, not to compete on the level of violence and harming another human being.
Intention is not part of the equation on objective ethics. It's what actually happens and what you consent to. So if you consent to entering property where stick beatings are a thing, then I mean that's your choice. Obviously you don't have to enter that property. And it would seem contradictory to say that you are going to enter this property and then demand that the property owner treat you in a certain way.
No,
Well,
I
that's his
never said
property.
that. Let's say out of whim, this bar overnight decides to enact those stick beatings. And obviously they did that without my consent.
Well, you don't get a consent on what happens on somebody else's property. Your consent is choosing to enter the property or not.
Okay. So how would for example, if we took let's move the concept of property to one's body, right? So you see these arguments all the time where people say, rape is okay as long as the 5-year-old child consented to it initially.
What the
But
fuck?
that goes back.
Stop. What do you mean you see these arguments all the time? If you're seeing those arguments all the time, you need to, I don't know where you are, but you need to stop going to those places. That's disgusting and terrible, and I don't see those arguments all the time. So just to clarify, but go ahead.
Well, there are the moral subjectivist libertarians that the people who define freedom as doing whatever you want based on your whim, right? And I'm not going to judge you, so if you want to do that, fine, right? If you want to violate the property of another human being, as long as that child consents to it, it's fine.
That's disgusting. Why are we talking about this? I mean, obviously, those are
because
some of the most inconsistent libertarians out there. I don't know what's the point.
I know that and you did a video on this in response to your Aunt Brooke on this topic specifically, and I watched it, and I know what your points are going to be.
Good.
But I just find it an anti-concept that you bundle the concept of consent between two sentient beings on the use of violence, because then the violence itself, right, the initiation of force between two sentient beings just dissipates the entire a priori concept of consent itself, right? I would say one consents for the value creation of mutual benefit between two sentient beings, right, through trade. That would be an example of consent actually working for efficient means in the world. I wouldn't say that someone consenting to violence would be okay. That person might be in the wrong mind to suggest that they would.
So you just ended the sport of football. You just ended boxing. You just ended UFC championships. Hell, you ended my ability to offer you $1 million to let me punch you. So you're going to exert control over me, over peaceful people and their peaceful agreements I'm assuming forcibly prevent them from entering into agreements where one is hurting the other. I mean, that's a violation of consent right there.
But I never suggested an external coercion upon two parties that want to commit violence onto each other, because in order to restrict that, I would have to use violence to prevent the violence, and that's just, I never said all that conundrum of things.
Okay, but what you did say is that it's not a right. And so if I'm violating somebody's right by consensually contracting to punch them, and you view that as a violation of rights, then you could respond with violence if you chose to.
Okay, but what happens if that person is equivocated in that situation? They're making obviously they're making an irrational mistake by consenting.
The only person that can determine if it's rational is that person. You don't get to determine for other people what's rational for them, and you don't get to determine for other people what they get to consent to. You don't get to judge other people's consent.
Not judging other people's consent, but I'm just saying, what if that person is not in the right state of mind, let's say, psychedelically, and just accepts violence in their life, right? Is that okay? Would just the permissiveness that consent entails would allow that person to live a miserable life full of pain and suffering?
I would not consent to any dispute resolution organization that respected contracts signed by intoxicated people. And I don't think most people would either.
Right. But think about the people that do run the risk of harming others through these, I call it equivocated behavior, because what they think is
I just
right.
rebutted everything you've been talking about for the last 20 minutes, and you just said right and continued on. Did you acknowledge that we have resolved that problem, or what?
Well, I've acknowledged that there could be multiple variables. It just doesn't end. It doesn't end in just one circumstance.
Okay.
There are multiple circumstances that you can bring up and where the possibility of rights fluctuating between individuals becomes a dangerous concept. To not say the word chaotic.
It depends on whose property they're on.
Then it's relative.
The agreements? Certainly.
Right. But I don't know what you're trying to imply. Like, is it
trying not to imply anything. I'm trying to state it outright. I just don't know what you're getting at.
Well, I'm getting at the fact where there could be multiple hypothetical situations in which the consent to violence might not be a moral proposition to make.
So is there any unresolved issues you have around what we just talked about, Jack?
No, just I'm being my skeptical self, right? And
nothing wrong with skepticism.
I'm sorry?
There's nothing wrong with skepticism.
Right. And when the issue of protection in a free society is a complex issue. And by complex, I mean there are multiple variables that involve a multitude of sentient beings interacting with one another.
Yep. Sure.
And that is in a mutual accordance with one another as well. Right.
And we are living in the worst case scenario right now. So we really only have one direction to go from here.
Well, I would argue that the state of anarchy exists right now, right? It's just that a group of warlords have centralized the use of force in a given geographical area. I mean, that doesn't take
that
the
is my
chaotic
argument. Yes.
out of it, right?
Yep.
So, if and really, if there is a guarantee that every system may devolve into authoritarianism, right? There is no guarantee that freedom is going to be a permanent, thing that human beings are going to indulge in or even exist within. You would agree with that, correct?
Are there any guarantees that people will continue to live peacefully once they've started living peacefully? I don't think there is any guarantees, no?
No, I don't think there's any guarantees either. It's just
What difference does that make?
well, the difference in what it makes is that since really the consequences of the any type of system that you try to I don't want to say implements because that implies the use of compulsion to achieve your ends. But let's say any system that could come to existence, right? I would imagine that there are problems facing in a anarcho-capitalist country that is not surrounded by other neighboring anarcho-capitalist countries in the world, which still purport to a monopoly over the use of violence in a given geographical area and have centralized the military and all their forms of defense.
And whatever those problems might be, the worst way to solve them would be with coercion.
Right.